Are you looking for inspiring conversations about faith, film, and life? You're in the right place. Here's the host who knows the right questions to ask, Father Edward Looney.
Hey everybody, it's Father Edward, and grateful you're tuning in for another conversation. Sometimes we talk film, sometimes we talk faith. Today we're going to talk about literature, and I'm very excited to have Joseph Pearce, who is a great scholar, on the show today. He has published a number of books. He's a native of England, currently living here in the United States, internationally acclaimed author of many books. He's hosted shows for EWTN. He's done some things for TAN Books, and he is a professor as well. So I'm sure we're going to get some great wisdom, especially about the classic literature and how it can be made simple for us today. So thank you so much, Doctor, for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and so maybe let's just talk a little bit first. I was looking at some of your other titles. We'll get to the classic literature, but I think people would classify J.R.R. Tolkien as a classic literature type of a guy. But you wrote a little book about the Lord of the Rings, specifically The Hobbit. So tell me about your fascination with the Lord of the Rings and what we could take away from that work.
Yeah, well, that is one of the 50 books included in Classic Literature Made Simple. But you're right, I've written 3 separate books on J.R.R. Tolkien. So Tolkien was a lifelong practicing Catholic. He said of The Lord of the Rings, and I'm quoting him word for word here, "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work." So my book, Frodo's Journey, Discovering the Hidden Meaning of The Lord of the Rings, looks at the Catholic dimension of The Lord of the Rings. And I wrote another book called Bilbo's Journey, which looks at the Catholic dimension of The Hobbit.
Okay, so of course it's finding these themes within it, and another one that just comes to mind, obviously for kind of the allusions to Christianity, is C.S. Lewis's *The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe*. There's a lot in there. That a lot of people have commented on. Whether it's the Book of Genesis or other things as well. So this is something that some authors do, is they kind of write these stories and they parallel scripture or Christian truths. Is that right?
Absolutely. In fact, you're hitting all my my hot button topics here, because I've also written a book for TAN Books called Further Up and Further In, Discovering Narnia, where I actually look at the deep Catholic dimension, or deep Christian dimension of all of the 7 books in the Chronicles of Narnia series, of which, of course, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was the first to be written.
Okay. Yeah, and I didn't see that one on your list, but now I scrolled down and yep, there it is. So that's great. So kind of just anticipate it. There's one other book that you've written that I just want to touch on, only because very kind of an iconic figure in a sense for those who watch the Eternal Word Television Network, EWTN. But you wrote a biography. It says it's the authorized biography of Father Richard Ho Lung, and it's called Candles in the Dark. And so he was a missionary of the poor, or maybe he still is. I'm not sure if he's passed, but how did you get to write his biography? They could have probably asked anybody, but they found you. And so did you have a personal connection to him, or what's inspiring about this priest?
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, I had no particular plan or desire to write his biography, but there's some people at TAN Books that are very heavily involved with the Missionaries of the Poor, the religious order that Father Ho Lung founded in Kingston, Jamaica. They actually have religious houses now, throughout the world, the third world in particular. They have a charism that it's to basically to serve the poorest of the poor, joyful service with Christ on the cross. So this embrace of suffering. So I was at first skeptical, because I write about writers, I don't write about religious. So it was a bit of a off the beaten track for me. But I went to their mother house in Kingston, Jamaica. Saw the work they did with the poorest of the poor there in the ghetto of Kingston, and prayerfully discerned that it was my calling, my duty and responsibility to respond to the request to write the biography. So that's what I did, and the biography is the consequence of those labors, which became a labor of love.
So was he alive when you wrote it? Were you able to interview him?
Yeah, and I believe he's still alive. Last I heard was a few months ago. He's old now and effectively retired, and I think his health is failing. He would be in his 80s now. But when I did the books about 10 years ago, he was in his 70s, still very vibrant, still very lively. And so I had several interviews with him and with other leading members of the Missionaries of the Poor. So I got lots of first-hand information about his life and about his work and the work of the other brothers of the order as background to allow me to write the book.
That's great. Obviously, doing a biography of him could inspire other people to that way of life, following that life, joining the community, but also just being inspired how God has raised up founders of communities throughout the centuries, and how he raised up and inspired this one, and to see the impact of his work is really profound. So, obviously, a great service you've done by providing that biography. So, we're supposed to be talking today about classic literature made simple. So maybe just tell us what makes a work a classic. So how does it get defined as a classic?
Well, basically, I sometimes say that the books like people, the best books like the best people are canonized. In other words, they become part of the canon. Now, of course, we have the canon of saints, those people who have been canonized by the church, who we now know definitively because of the authority which the church has from Christ, are in heaven. Well, the great books of Western civilization, the great books of Christian civilization, similarly can be canonized. We have a canon of great books. And the real test, I talk in the first chapter about there being four types of books: good books, bad books, good books, and bad books. In the sense that books can be good as literature, in other words, good as beauty and art, but also good in terms of morality. But they could also be bad in terms of art and bad in terms of morality. So the great books are those which are good books. That basically they're great in terms of their literary merit, but also they're great in terms of the theological, philosophical truths that they convey. And they also have to be able to stand the test of time. So a good book, like a good wine, improves with age. And if it's still being read 50 years after it's published, it should be taken seriously. If it's just fashionable at the time it's written, as C.S. Lewis said, fashions are always coming and going, but mostly going. In other words, if something's up to date, it's pretty soon going to be out of date. It's about something being perennial. Talks about the permanent things, the things that don't change. That's what makes a great book. That's why we can still read books written by Homer and Virgil, that even before the time of Christ, and certainly all the works of the Middle Ages, Shakespeare, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, okay. And one of the things I know is there's this craze about the great books curriculum or program or something like that. Boy, her name escapes me, but there's Jessica Hooten Wilson or something like that. She's a professor who's been writing a lot about reading well. That's Kathleen Pryor, I think, or something. But she does great books and how to read and all this. And so essentially, the 50 you cover, would they be considered the great books curriculum? Are they all included on that list, or are there some that aren't a part of that great books?
Well, thanks be to God that the Catholic Church and Christianity in general have given us so many great books that there's certainly far more than 50. So I selected 50, but I could have. There are several hundred. There are 200, 300, 400 books that probably could be on that list. So these are certainly some of the key ones, but not all of the key ones. And certainly many of the books in my book would be on a classical liberal arts curriculum. And I rejoice at the fact that these classical academies are springing up all over the country, this revival of a good, solid Catholic liberal arts education, which is really catching on.
Yeah, that's great. And for sure, you see studies that say if you read the classics, that there's something, like they are more successful, or they're better equipped in terms of morality and just being faithful Christians and Catholics and all that. So there is something about reading these good books. Before we dive into maybe a few of the books that you have in that number of 50 that you've covered, today there are lots of authors out there. There's lots of books being published. You walk into a Barnes and Noble, you can see the contemporary books and everything. Are there any good books that you think, you kind of use that metric of 50 years from now? Do you think there's any books today being written that maybe someone will be talking about 50 years from today?
Yes, I do. So I bended my own rules or broke my own rules because the 50 books that I've selected for this are arranged chronologically. So the earliest is the Iliad by Homer, which dates back 2,500 years or more, in fact, 2,700 years probably. But the two most recent are by authors that are still alive today, Tim Powers and Michael D. O'Brien. So I do believe there are books being published that will still be read 50 years from now. In fact, I'm also keen on keeping my finger on the pulse of contemporary Catholic literature as well. I've got shelves full of 21st century Catholic novels and poetry. So I'm very much keeping my finger on the pulse of contemporary, current Catholic cultural revival, which we see happening now. So, yeah, I mean, this is a living culture. The church has inspired great works of literature for the last 2,000 years. And I have no doubt at all that that will continue.
So if someone was to say, I want to read a classic book, what book do you think they should start with? What should be their first read? Because, it's kind of like the scriptures. You think about the scriptures and you're reading the Bible, and maybe you get to Leviticus and you're like, I'm done with this. I can't read the Bible anymore. So I'm sure someone could maybe pick up the classics and there'd be a book there. And maybe it's not the book someone should pick up for the first time as like trying to immerse themselves in this kind of literature style. So is there one that maybe lends itself to a novice classical reader?
Yeah, well, the first thing, the difficult thing of a question like that is if I'd like to be able to speak to the individual concerned.
Sure.
Every human person, thanks be to God, is unique, and find out what are they interested in. That would allow me to hone in. So some of these works require help for the novice reader, which is why I wrote my book, Classic Literature Made Simple, so that people can read that as a means of understanding these works and then deciding themselves. I'm hoping each of these chapters might serve as an appetizer. So they say, oh, that particular book looks interesting to me for whatever reason, and then they go and buy it. But probably if you're new to the classics, you should probably start with some of the more recent 19th and 20th century classics, which are more accessible because the English is, should we say, more up to date than some of the older medieval or Shakespeare, what have you. But Shakespeare is not anywhere near as difficult as people think he is. A lot of people, suffer from Shakespeare phobia. But really, Shakespeare's like learning to ride a bike. You have to make a bit of an effort at first for the first hour or so, and then you just learn to read the language and be at home with the language, and you can then really get to enjoy these great plays that he wrote. Now, also, I wrote three books on Shakespeare, showing that Shakespeare was a devout Catholic living in very anti-Catholic times. When Shakespeare was alive, it was punishment by death to be a priest in England, and punishment by death to hide a priest from the authorities in England. This was the England in which Shakespeare lived, and this tyranny in which he found himself as a Catholic is the backdrop to many of his plays. So, Catholics would be very surprised at how very relevant to themselves as Catholics and to the age in which we live, because it's about religious liberty, religious freedom, and the power of Caesar to overreach himself in trying to crush religious freedom for the purposes of secularism. That Shakespeare was dealing with that in his time. We're dealing with that today. So people would be very surprised at how relevant and up to date the works of William Shakespeare are.
Wow. One of the questions as a priest who talks a lot and promotes the saints, people ask me, well, who's your favorite saint? So I'll tell them, I'll give them an answer. And yeah, and typically I say, devotion to saints goes through seasons in my life. Like I'm very devoted to this person now, but maybe 10 months from now, it'll be a different saint that enters in and kind of wins me over and becomes my intercessor for the time or whatever. So I'm sure it's kind of the same way, maybe for literature, that maybe it's seasonal. There's a certain book that right now it's my favorite and I highly recommend it. Maybe a year from now, there'll be another one you've revisited and you kind of become the apologist for that book. So I guess I'm wondering, what's your favorite of the 50 books that you've highlighted? Which one is the one that you would recommend the most?
Well, yeah, I agree with you, Father. That one can go through periods or seasons when one particular saint is more important than another, and same thing with books. So I say jokingly about people asking which is my favorite Shakespeare play. I say, well, it's King Lear on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and Hamlet at weekends on Tuesdays and Thursdays. In other words, I oscillate. I can't really necessarily make up my mind. But of the 50 books I've selected, I would probably have to choose between Dante's Divine Comedy. Now, Dante was a disciple of St. Thomas Aquinas, philosophically and theologically. So his work is profoundly and deeply Catholic, though not necessarily very easy to read. You have to read the right edition. But so Dante's Divine Comedy, or one of those two plays by Shakespeare I mentioned, Hamlet or King Lear, or in fast forwarding, I really am a great aficionado and lover of J.R.R. Tolkien. So the Lord of the Rings would certainly be up there with those.
So what do you think of the Lord of the Rings movies? Of course, people always say the movies aren't as good as the books. So obviously you're an aficionado, you're an expert on J.R.R. Tolkien. So what are your thoughts about the films that have been created?
Well, the first thing I would say is that if we're talking about a film adaptation of a classic work of literature, the first thing we should do, as a rule of thumb, ideally, is to make a point of reading the book before watching the film. And there's a very good reason for that. Because once we've seen the film first, our imagination has been gate crashed by the characters and by the presentation of the plot by the producer and director of the film. So we read The Lord of the Rings after watching the Peter Jackson movies. We're going to see Ian McKellen as Gandalf. It's much better to be able to read the book ourselves and then judge the movie for the perspective of what our imagination has already done with the text. So that's the first golden rule. Ideally, if you know there's going to be a new movie version of a classic work of literature and you haven't read it already, make a point of reading the book before watching the film. First golden rule. As regards my view on the Lord of the Rings movies, I very much enjoy, and I've watched several times, and I'm looking forward to watching again and again and again, the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films. But the Hobbit films are horrible. I saw the first one, and I thought it was terrible. Someone told me the second was worse, so I didn't bother to watch the second and third. And as for the Rings of Power, that's what an orc would do with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. So I haven't watched those and won't. But I do love the Peter Jackson original Lord of the Rings movies from 20 or so years ago.
Okay, well, there you have it. So that's good to know. In classic literature made simple, what I kind of envision, so somebody goes over, they buy the book, so they pick it up, they read chapter one. So whatever book you're covering in chapter one, maybe they read what you've written, and then would your recommendation be then go read that classic piece of literature, and then maybe read chapter two of your book, the second book you've selected, and then pick up that book and just kind of read your background information first before they dive into the classical text itself? Is that kind of the end goal in mind?
Well, that would be the ideal, perfect consequence of my writing the book, but I don't think it's very practical. How many people have enough time to systematically read through 50 works? Being more realistic, what I'm hoping is they'll read my book, and then of those 50 chapters, those 50 books, there may be 5 or 6 or 7 that particularly intrigue or interest them because the subject matter is something that excites them. And they'll go out and maybe read 5 or 6 of those 50 as a consequence of reading my book. If that were the case, I would be delighted to consider it that the book has been a success in that alone. I'm hoping my book is an appetizer so that people will gain the appetite for the main course, which is the work itself.
Yeah, that's a great analogy that you've offered there. And kind of too, I would think like sometimes, we don't have enough time to read, as you said, kind of all of these books. But at least by reading your take and kind of introducing us to these 50 books, someone could be talking to us, talking with us about one of these works. And then we'll at least have a basic knowledge, like, for example, and maybe this is terrible to admit, but I haven't read Brideshead Revisited. And I've tried, but I've always stopped at like chapter 2. So I don't know if you include it, but if I read Brideshead Revisited and read somebody's commentary, at least then maybe I could at least intelligibly understand and maybe even say a few points about it, just because I've read something like your take or someone else's take on it.
Well, that's a great. I'm really pleased you raised that subject because Brideshead Revisited is one of the 50 classics in my book. Yeah, it's one of my favorite novels. I've taught it many times at college level. Just to very, very briefly, the two things that is the takeout from Brideshead Revisited. The title, Who's the Brideshead? The Brideshead is the bridegroom. So Brideshead Revisited is the bridegroom revisited. It's basically the work is ultimately about Christ and his church, the Catholic Church specific in the sacraments. So the whole first half of the book, which is why many people don't get to finish it, yourself included, is many of the main characters. There are a couple of two or three really faithful characters who are always solidly Catholic, but some of the central characters get further and further away from the church. In the first half of the book, they're drifting further away, which can be very discouraging for the reader if they're a good Catholic. And the first half of the book ends symbolically on Good Friday. But then the second half of the book, the twitch upon the thread, grace prevails, and these characters come back to the practice of the faith, and it ends symbolically on Easter Sunday. So the book is profoundly Catholic by a profoundly, solidly Catholic author, Evelyn Waugh, and it's his greatest novel. It's one of the great Catholic novels of all time, but it's not necessarily easy, and certainly you do have to be patient because you're looking at some of these characters in the early chapters, and they're degenerate and they're decadent and they're behaving badly. And it's very easy to say, "Well, I'm done with them." But if you follow them through the journey, you see how it's like the prodigal son. They wander off, they end up wallowing with the pigs, but then they come back home to Holy Mother Church at the end.
Oh, yes. And I know that Bishop Barron, he's a big fan of Brideshead Revisited. He's written about it a lot. Now, I also see in your background there, you have G.K. Chesterton there, and G.K. Chesterton wrote a great number of books of Catholic works, of treating the Catholic faith and so forth. So, anything from G.K. Chesterton make your list of 50? Or I just want to maybe ask too, what's a good recommendation to get to know G.K. Chesterton?
That's a great question, Father. Well, my first ever book as a Catholic, published back in the 90s, was a biography of G.K. Chesterton called Wisdom and Innocence, A Life of G.K. Chesterton. And that was an act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, but also an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God, because Chesterton was the single most, under grace, the single most important influence on my conversion. That's why he's looking over my shoulder there. This is Tolkien over there, and that's a map of Middle Earth. So I'm surrounded by good things here. And my Chesterton and Belloc collection of books are right behind me, and Shakespeare's down here. So I'm in good company here. So the one book that makes the classic literature made simple book by Chesterton is The Man Who Was Thursday, which is his best and best known novel. It's not necessarily that easy, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's the place that people should start. What I usually say when people say have never read Chesterton but want to, I do actually recommend my book, Wisdom and Innocence, A Life of Chesterton, because it goes through his life, but it also quotes from his works as he's writing them, giving a paragraph and an explanation. So it's a good panoramic overview of the whole of the man, his life and his works in one volume. And my book's a little bit chunky, however, and if that's intimidating, Dal Ahlquist, the president of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, has written several books on Chesterton, including, for instance, Common Sense 101. These are slim introductions to Chesterton. So I would normally say to basically begin Chesterton gently by reading these books that introduce you to him, because his writing style can be a little bit daunting and difficult for some readers. So I would probably suggest that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know some of his titles like Everlasting, the Everlasting Man, for example, or some others out there. Now, what's interesting too about him is he wrote some kind of novels, right? Like they were crime novels about Father Brown. And then
Yes.
I think the other interesting thing about Chesterton is I'm confusing him with Mark Twain. Never mind. So I was going to say he had a devotion to Saint Joan of Arc, but no, that was Mark Twain. So
Well, Chesterton also did have a devotion to St. Joan of Arc, as well. He wrote about her. Obviously, he's a convert to the faith. And speaking of French saints, the church in which he was received to the church was dedicated to a newly canonized saint at that time. he was received in the church in 1922, and the church was dedicated to Saint Therese of Lisieux, who had just been ordained at that point as a new saint. So as a French saint, he was certainly devoted and connected to. But he wrote books on St. Francis of Assisi. That's a book I would recommend as a possible beginning book. He wrote another book on St. Thomas Aquinas. So he certainly had a great love of both those two saints, the great founder of the Franciscans, St. Francis, also that great Dominican, St. Thomas Aquinas. So if you had to name two saints that were particularly close to Chesterton, it would probably be those two.
Okay, wow. So classic literature made simple. So sometimes people are intimidated by it, and you're trying to make it accessible so that they can better appreciate these classic texts. It's your new book available from Ignatius Press, and the people can head on over there and pick up a copy. And if people want to learn more about all the books you've written, you're very prolific. If they want to maybe listen to some of your lectures or something like that, where could they find more about you online?
Yeah, the best place for me is the best one-stop place for me is my own personal website, and that's jpearce.co. So jpearce.co. And there's a book tab there, so you can go there and see all my books, and there's links to how to purchase them from the publishers. But my blog and my inner sanctum, where there's exclusive audio and video content. So yeah, go to jpearce.co and you can keep up with what I'm up to.
Well, that's great. You're a great mind, a great intellectual in the church today, and really helping us appreciate so much about literature and its connection to faith. So thanks so much for your time and for sharing what you shared today on the show.
Thank you, Father, for having me. God bless you.
If you liked today's episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening. And don't forget to stay up to date with what Father Edward is doing by following him on Facebook, X, or Instagram at the handle @FREdwardLooney. Thanks for listening, and please join Father Edward again next time for another inspiring conversation.